Hi, I'm going to talk about nesting and particularly the use holes option with nesting and talk about how it works and some of the limitations. It does have some limitations on what it's capable of understanding about how you want to nest, and so I just want to kind of talk about that and show how the grouping that you do has some effect on how things will be nested. So anyway, some of it's pretty simplistic, but it sort of leads towards kind of the process of use holes, so bear with me. So anyway, if I have an object that I select, and in this case I have a container hole, so you see that I'm sorting with a container hole, and these objects are not grouped together, but once I select them they get sorted automatically into the container hole combinations. If I select this other object to go with it and I tell it I want to nest, I'm going to turn off use holes to begin with, and I click apply. You'll see that they get nested like you might imagine they would get nested, and it does not place the smaller object inside the sorted holes. So if I go back here now and select the same two objects and turn on use holes, it recognizes that sorted hole is what I want to use as a whole, and so it'll nest inside of that. So that container hole combination that gets created is recognized and utilized, even though that these two objects are not grouped together. And so grouping does play a part in this, and so how objects are grouped does have an effect, as we'll see, on how the objects get sorted and how they get utilized for nesting purposes. So anyway, now if I have, let's say I have this object here, and I bring it in here and I select them, and I get a container and two holes, and it would do as you would imagine it would do. It recognizes those both as holes. If I add this object into the interior of one of those holes, if I select it again, then I get a container hole container. And so now the question is, what does EnRoute do when I go to nest that? So let's select it here, and I'm going to turn off use holes the first time, click apply, and so you see that extra container is recognized as a separate object, and so the container hole combination holds these together as a single object, even though they're not grouped together. And then as it continues to sort, you see that I have another container, and so that gets nested separately. So if I delete that, and let's select it again and come in here and tell it I want to use holes this time, you'll see that the object does get nested inside the hole. It didn't leave it where it was, so you weren't telling it to keep it together. You just said nest this container inside the hole, and so it did it here in this case in the lower left corner of the biggest hole, and that's where it fit. So that works like that. So if I were to group these, so let's group this together as a container hole combination, and now if I select the object, now what's a little confusing about this is the way that it sorts. It still looks like that's a hole, which for nesting purposes that's not really going to be true. If I was going to toolpath, then it would treat it like that, but in this case, when I'm nesting, it does recognize that is a separate object because I have it grouped together. And so if I click apply, you see that object, that grouped object, stayed together as a container hole, and because I had use holes selected, it nested it inside the hole. So grouping certainly plays a part in the decisions that the nester makes about how things should be kept together when they nest. And so now let's look at another type of grouping. So I'm going to ungroup this, and if I bring those all together as a group, then this is where the result that you get at least on the surface, might seem to not really make sense, but hopefully you'll see kind of how the decision gets made. So once this is grouped together, now instead of that being a separate container, whoops, I guess I haven't grouped them together yet. I'm going to go ahead and do that. Instead of that being a separate container, it's part of this group. So when En-ROUTE goes to nest that, it will see these objects, these 4 contours, as all belonging together. Now what makes the situation a little more complicated is the whole use holes option. And if I do tell En-ROUTE I want to use holes, it looks at the nesting level, or the sorting level of the objects. And so here I have a container, hole, container. And so if you think of the sorting level as kind of 0, 1, 2, that object that is sorted as level 2, so it's deeper than a container hole, that makes things a little more complex from En-ROUTE's perspective, from a use holes perspective. And so at this point, what En-ROUTE does is when it recognizes that extra level of sorting, it says use holes doesn't make sense because I don't really know for sure where that extra inner container is going to be in terms of nesting inside of that. And so at this point, it makes the decision that use holes is not appropriate, and therefore when I go to nest, and let's select this extra object here, when I go to nest, you'll see that the nest representative, the contours basically that get created to represent the object, doesn't include the inner contours or the inner holes, and so it's only including the outer perimeter of the object for nesting purposes. And so even if I have use holes selected, it's going to make the decision that that's not possible because of the way that object is grouped together. And so it's unfortunate in the sense that it doesn't automatically recognize the fact that it does have a hole that's available, but at this point that's the decision that En-ROUTE makes, is that because of that extra sort of level of complication, it doesn't recognize the use holes as being possible. And so from the user's perspective, let's say if I remove this, and let's say I've got some text in there, in this case I've got it and it's been converted to curves, I've got that same sort of container hole thing like I do here. And so if I have this grouped together, then when I select that object to nest, it's going to recognize that extra sorting level, and it's going to say it doesn't make sense to nest inside the holes. And so in that case, it's going to make the decision to not make this hole available to nest inside of. So if we wanted to nest this oval inside of that, because of the way that's grouped, it's not really going to work. So that is a limitation of the use holes option, is if I have kind of that extra interior object selected as part of my group, then it's not going to allow that because it's going to see that added complication. If I have just an extra hole in there, that's not a problem. It's going to sort that, and it just sees the container hole combination without the extra interior part, and it's going to say that's okay. So anyway, that's how the use holes option works. If I add toolpaths to this, so let's say I'm going to toolpath this, and I had the wrong option chosen there. I'm going to make it external. Okay, so now I've got a toolpath group selected and with a container hole, and if I go to nest inside that, it's going to work fine. You see I've got that inner hole, and in this case it's using on the outside it's using the toolpath because it's larger, and on the inside it's using the toolpath because it's smaller. So if I have use hole selected, it's going to nest inside that toolpath. And so that is something that is possible. But you'll notice that this toolpath needed to be applied to the container hole combination. And one thing that users tend to do sometimes is to, let's delete these toolpaths, is to apply a toolpath to the outside here, and then possibly apply a toolpath here to the inside. And it might be a different strategy for whatever reason, because it's a hole, and then group it. And at least from an appearance standpoint, you'd say, well, that's the same as if I did the single strategy to the container hole combination. Unfortunately, Enroute doesn't really see it that way, and so it sees this as a container, and it's grouped as part of the group there. And so if I go to nest here, it sees the nest representative of the inner object, and it will select it. But you notice that it doesn't realize that you want to go to the inside of the toolpath. So the nest representative in this case, because it's a container, is the largest contour. And so since that outer contour is the largest contour, it sees that. When it goes to nest, it will nest it it sorts it and nests it as a container hole. So if I say use hole, it does it. The problem is it doesn't recognize the need to avoid the toolpath, and so it's liable to place the object either very close to the toolpath or even overlapping the toolpath without realizing that that's kind of what you're trying to avoid. So if you're going to use a toolpath object as the inner hole that you want to nest inside, it really needs to be part of the container hole combination of the outer contour and the inner contour. So this needs to really be a hole as part of that group, as opposed to an internal female offset. You can argue that that's not correct, and I wouldn't probably argue with you about that, but that's the way it works now, is the way that it recognizes the interior object and the way that nest representative is created in Enroute. And so anyway, toolpaths work fine, and it nests inside using the holes for toolpaths within the context of a container hole routing offset as being what it's looking for in terms of what makes sense from using it as a whole. So it'll do it in this case, and if you can define margins and borders to make sure you stay away from that inner toolpath, that's fine, but that's not specifically what Enroute is looking for that nest representative. So anyway, that's the use holes, and a lot of information and a lot of kind of what ifs in terms of grouping and all of that sort of thing, but hopefully it helps to understand the capabilities and also the limitations of the use hole option for nesting inside Enroute. So thanks.